Okay, so lesson today is some refactoring. We'll be doing some refactoring of our tab controller and our view controllers. We'll be using dependency injection, and we'll be fully encapsulating our view controllers by making all their properties private. Again, encapsulation is part of object-oriented programming. We described object-oriented programming as a concept in computer science or programming in general, where you use objects, or you try to emulate real world objects into programs. You encapsulate the data, meaning you have your properties all private, and the only way somebody else is able to access your properties is via an initializer or some sort of method, okay? That's the only way. Currently, with storyboards, pre-iOS 13, with storyboards, there was no way to use dependency injection with our iOS applications, right? But as we did in Unit 4, we have view controllers all done programmatically. So with that, we're able to fully encapsulate our view controllers. So today, what we'll be doing is doing some refactoring with all our view controllers, including our tab controller. We'll be making all our view controller properties private. And the only way to set, for example, my data persistence in my newsfeed controller would be via an initializer, right? So what we introduce in there is a new topic via dependency injection and custom initializers on our view controllers, right? And what we do today programmatically, tomorrow we'll take it a step into storyboards. Because new in iOS 13, you could inject properties on a storyboard using dependency injection, right? So today we'll do initializers via programmatic code, and tomorrow we'll introduce a storyboard file, and we'll inject that file using new iOS 13 dependency injection initializers, okay? So those are the two topics we'll be covering between today and tomorrow. Today, refactor our view controllers, our programmatic view controllers with initializers, inject them with whatever dependencies they need, make sure all our properties are private. By doing that, we're introducing full encapsulation to our view controllers. So know what encapsulation really means. Encapsulation says all my properties are private, right? Right now, our data persistence is public, correct? Right? So that's not full encapsulation there. Because anybody could access my data persistence, it's public. But we'll have an initializer. The initializer will be the only way to set that data persistence or user preference, whatever object you want. For example, our assessment yesterday, we had cards. We needed to have whatever card public, but ideally the best way is to fully encapsulate it with an initializer, okay? So what we're introducing today, encapsulation, dependency injection, custom initializers, okay? If we're following along here, I actually put some notes already on the New York Times top stories we've been using. New York Times top stories here. So what we're introducing today is encapsulation on our view controller properties using dependency injection with designated initializers. All right? So as we see here, our data persistence will be private. Our user preference, if you used it, will be private here. And the only way we pass that information over to the view controller is via a custom initializer. And this required init here is required, very similar to when we did our view setup code, right? There's a required init there. With our view controller, same thing maintains here. We need to implement the required init as well. And here we'll be actually using an instance of the newsfeed view controller, and the only way to pass it data is via this initializer, okay? So that's what we'll be covering today. And for people who want to look at tomorrow, we'll cover storyboards tomorrow using dependency injection. Same, new in iOS 13, you could inject your storyboard using this instantiate view controller identifier with creator here. This is new in iOS 13. Because before that, we could not inject our storyboards with dependencies. Right? We had to make our properties public like we've been doing so far. Okay, cool? Very good. All right, so let us start off here by going to our newsfeed controller first. So let's navigate to our newsfeed controller. Don't be alarmed if you do not have a user preference here. I refactored the code, as I said before, with a user preference wrapper for user defaults. Yes? Cool. So feel free to look at the repo if you want to update your code there. But so far we have a public data persistence and a public user preference. So let's start off by breaking some code. We'll make those private. So basically at the end of the day, there should be no public properties on your view controllers. Because full encapsulation says all properties should be private. Okay? Only way to access them is via methods. Great. Any questions so far about encapsulation? Because knowing how to explain that is paramount to the process, the interview process there. Knowing how to explain object-oriented programming, inheritance, polymorphism, encapsulation there. We'll keep going through those topics, but please, please, please pay attention to those topics and know what they are. Okay, so at this point, we have broken our code because now our data persistence is private and we have errors on our tab bar controller. Because right now the tab bar controller cannot access the data persistence, right? Do we all have those errors there? Yes? Okay, perfect. Let's go back to the newsfeed controller and create an initializer for the data persistence. If you do not have a user preference, just simply create an initializer that takes in a data persistence. If you have a user preference, follow what I do. If you do not have it, just have data persistence. So far, so good? Okay. So we have our properties up here. I'll just say properties.
Wait, no. How do you get the data persistence? Is this what we have to import that you, or is something?
Everybody should have data persistence.
No, how do you get the user preference?
Keep it for later. For now, just do data persistence. Because if you have to add in the user preference, you need to do more than just like add the class itself. It's throughout the code. Wherever you're doing user defaults, it's been refactored to use user preference wrapper. Cool? Very good. Was there a hand there? Okay, so properties here, properties. Okay, good. So right below our properties, we'll have initializers. Well, that's still a property, sorry. Right above my load view, I'll say initializers. Great. So at this point, our newsfeed needs a data persistence, right? So we'll create an initializer, data persistence of type data persistence. It's a generic type, so you have to give the type that the data persistence is. Here it's an article. And I'll say self.data persistence equals to data persistence. And I'll call the super initializer. And here we need to implement the required. So go ahead and fix it here. Okay. For me, I have a user preference. If you do not have a user preference, there's no need to add this user preference here. We follow everybody? Yes? Okay. Great. So here we created our designated initializer or custom initializer. It takes in a data persistence. Okay? And if you have a user preference, it takes in a user preference. And this required init is required. The minute you say, I want to implement my own custom init on a view controller, you have to implement this required init. Okay. Next up, oh, sorry. There's still going to be an error in the tab controller.
Oh, you mean, no, not that.
Do we need the name in the bundle? Or is that for each?
No, just passing nil as the values there.
It's saying,
What's your error? Make sure you initialize your data persistence first before you call super. What's the error say?
it's saying that my data persistence, when I put self, my data persistence, equals data persistence, it's saying that's a number.
Did you declare your data persistence generic with article?
Yeah.
Thank you, Luba.
Oh, my God.
Okay, cool. Can we go up? Yes? Still typing? Okay, let's go up to where we declared our data persistence here. At this point, again, we had to bang, or we had to implicitly unwrap our data persistence with some value, right? In order for the compiler to, in order for our code to compile, right? Because we needed to say data persistence has a default value. Because this is a class requires you to give your property a default value. What's the default value of data persistence here? Nil, right? Again, we all should just be answering that in unison there. At this point in the program, right? If I have an optional, the default value is nil, right? So here, I could remove this nil here, and I won't get a compiler error. Because now I have an initializer. Everybody with me? So no longer will you come to your newsfeed controller and get some error saying data persistence is nil, right? I'll also do the same thing for user preference. I'm in a class needs all its properties to have a default value. If they do not have a default value, what do I need to do? What do I need to do if it doesn't have a default value? Siren? Those are the questions that an IA could ask you, right? And you have to come up with that answer there. I'm in a class. I have properties that do not have default values. How do I fix that? Have an initializer or initialize them. One of the two. Everybody? I know you said it. I want the rest of the class, right? I know you're on point there, but I want the whole class to be on point.
I'm trying to look out for my fellow.
Yes, but we have to get the answers everywhere, because that's back in Unit 1, right? Unit 1, we did all that, but now we have to know when it's asked how to answer them. And here, we remove our implicit optional, because now we have an initializer. Everybody? Right? Across the board? Those are questions we need to be able to answer. Fair game here. Okay, cool. So my newsfeed is pretty good. I'll go to my tab controller, and let's address the errors we have. So back in our tab controller, the one place we have an error, we all have one error, right? Coming from the tab bar controller? Okay, so let's fix that. First, let's see what the error says. The error says, cannot invoke initializer for type newsfeed without arguments. Because right now, the only way to create a newsfeed view controller is either you use the coder initializer or you use the initializer that we created, right? So no longer will that code work in your project, right? That's already making our project even more robust and more best practice approach there. Because now, a newsfeed controller could never get created without its required dependencies, right? That's where we say dependency injection. Like, this is true dependency injection. If you use dependency injection and you individually pass in like a book, an article, whatever, there's still a potential error there. Because we've seen many crashes where we get to newsfeed, it crashes because data persistence doesn't have a data persistence, or it hasn't been instantiated. Everybody? But if you fully use dependency injection, there's no way to get to newsfeed without that data persistence having a value, right? Unless the tab bar itself doesn't have a value. Everybody with me? Yes?
So if this is dependency injection, what were we doing before?
It's still considered dependency injection, but to me, full dependency injection means using an initializer on that object. Right? If you don't use an initializer on that object, you're breaking the model of what dependency injection means. Dependency injection means you give the object everything it needs. Right? And the programmer, as we know, there's many ways we could go wrong there. We forgot to pass in some dependency. But with an initializer, there's no way to forget that. Does that make sense? Cool? So when you associate dependency injection, please associate it with an initializer from now on. Everybody? Going forward. Yes, sir?
So on line 27, we set the delegate.
27. Oh, we'll come there. We'll fix that.
Oh.
We'll fix that as we go.
Okay.
Because that's now going to be added to the initializer.
Okay.
Cool? Very good. Because that's also going to break. Because right now, that's private as well. It doesn't show up here yet, but it's private. The user preference object. Okay, cool. So let's go forward. Let's actually redo our newsfeed controller. So newsfeed controller, now we have two initializers. Do we see that? We have a one that has a coder, which we're not using there, and we have the one we created, the data persistence. So for the data persistence, let's go ahead and implement it, and we pass in data persistence. Type it out because right now the compiler doesn't see it. And for user preference, I have user preference and build. And now I have the errors ahead, right? The compiler gives me one error first, teases me, but I have more errors now because all those properties are private. Everybody? So no longer can I just say on line 22, access data persistence, because this is what the compiler says there. It's inaccessible. It's private, right? So at this point, we fully encapsulated our view controller, right? The only way to access data persistence is via the initializer, okay? So we'll clean up our code here. We'll remove view controller data persistence. We'll remove all that code here. Remove the delegate. You don't have a delegate, don't worry about it. But I'm cleaning up my code here. And this is that, right? 2 lines of code. Way better, way cleaner. Any questions about what we just did? Yes?
So in this case, it's really just the reason we do this is to protect that, like.
Well, the reason we do is because we say we're doing object-oriented programming, right? And to really say you're doing object-oriented programming is to encapsulate your properties, meaning to hide them. And the way we hide them is to make them. How do we hide our properties? We make them private, right? So that's encapsulation. That's the definition of encapsulation. Making your properties private.
But the like main goal for that project oriented programming is to like what would we consider the real reason for that?
The real reason for not making your properties public?
The real reason for us to program in this way.
Well, first of all, it creates, it avoids a lot of bugs, right? That's like one of the big reasons, because now, once we get to our news feed, our data persistence is set already. Everything that we need to be set is set. There's no way I'll crash unless my tab controller has a nil object, passing that nil object over.
Yeah,
I'm no longer forgetting to set objects, right? That's number one, avoid crashes. Number two, it's easier to test my newsfeed view controller. If I want to test it as a unit test, I could inject it with the properties and see if it acts as it should. 3, if I say I'm an object-oriented programmer, I'm breaking the principles by making my properties public. Cool? So there's a lot of pros there with why to do it this way. Okay? Any other questions?
you don't need to set delegate?
I need to go to the initializer. Do you have a user preference? Okay, so if you have a user preference, you would have to go, which we'll do for the saved article, right? Okay, we haven't done the saved article yet. But if you do have a user preference, at this point, as Luba says, I need to go to my initializer. I need to go to my initializer for my news feed here and set the delegate. Okay? We'll do the same thing, very similar for, we'll do the same thing, let me do this here. We'll do the same similar thing for the saved article. Because at this point, I think I'm the only person that has the user preference, right? If you have a user preference, this was the code you're gonna write. But we write a code very similar for the saved article. The only place we set the delegate is on what view controller for this project. Who wants to listen for changes? The saved article view controller, right? So we're not doing it in the newsfeed. Everybody clear here?
Because we had it there for some reason. It was for using that.
Cool. All right, so good. So at this point, we have no errors. We fully encapsulated our newsfeed. We'll go now over to our article detail controller and do the same thing. So at this point, we have no more public properties, right? Everything is private explicitly, okay? Let's move on to our detail controller. We have public. We have a public article. We have a public data persistence, okay? We'll do the same thing. We'll mark them private. We'll remove the optional. We'll mark our data persistence private as well. We'll remove the implicit optional, okay? And let me actually put my constant above. I'll put my constant above my variable here. And those are properties. I'm in the article detail controller. And we are encapsulating our view controller by using an initializer. This is still good. This is fine. And we'll put our initializers down here. And what does this need? This view controller needs, yes, exactly. So it needs data persistence of type data persistence, generic type article, and it needs an article of type article. We need our required init here. And let's go ahead and set our objects. So first I have self data persistence equals to data persistence. I have self article equal to article. And I call super init with name, and we just pass in nil for those two values. I build, and the errors I'm getting is back in my tab controller.
I have a question.
Yes.
For example, if our view controllers have table views and collection views, should we be setting the delegation inside the initializer rather than when the view loads?
If you have an initializer, you could set it there, right? Like you set it the minute you create it, everything it needs, that's fine, as opposed to the view did load.
Okay.
Yeah, that cleans up your view did load. Cool. Anytime you could take out code from view did load, it's very similar to syn delegate, it's better.
All right.
Yeah. Yes?
What is the supernet name?
So using back in unit 1, right, when we have an initializer, this is inheritance. If I am using my own initializer, I need to call my parent's initializer. Right, so this is the view controller's parent initializer, the super init with name.
Okay, and then also why are we using required in it?
Required is required because view controller is a protocol, it conforms to NS coding protocol, and NS coding protocol requires anybody subclassing or having a custom initializer to implement required initializer.
Have we never custom initialized the view controller before?
No, not from my recollection there. Anybody, right? We haven't done that because we've done everything in storyboards, and we kept the new iOS 13 injection in storyboards for later because it was just too much, and then you have to know the old way first to begin with. But now, as we go into Unit 5, we're more mature as developers. We should know all the right ways and the new ways as well. Okay? What's that, Luba? Duba, what's the question?
Do we have an article?
It needs an article. This is the detail view. I click on a cell, I go to the article, it needs that article that you selected in order to show the image and everything about the article.
The first one is just.
The first one is just the collection view of articles. Very good. Okay, cool. So let's go back to our tab controller and fix any questions before we go back to the tab controller.
It's saying, insert media, it's saying that, this is the initializer or the view controller cannot delegate with some time.
You haven't called super. That should be super.
Oh, because I did.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's navigate back to our tab controller. And where's our errors here? Oh, sorry, not the tab bar. Look at that. Not the tab bar, sorry. Back in article detail. Oh, okay. So right now, what's happening here? No longer is my article an optional. You could click on the arrow that takes you, go to your update UI. Go to your update UI in your detail controller. Go to your update UI. Do we all have an error on our guard? Right, because no longer is what? The article is no longer a?
I don't have an error on my card.
Because you haven't removed the implicit, your optional here.
Gotcha.
Okay, because right now we do not need this anymore. Our article is no longer an optional. Right, so our code is just like way better here, really, across the board. Because no longer, we just start taking out code, right? It's like cleaning the apartment.
Yeah.
So here, no longer do we need to guard the article because the article is not optional. Everybody? So we're taking out lines of code here. So this is gone.
You take out the whole article in general and then just use it.
This is gone. This is gone.
Oh, wow.
Cool? Great. I don't think we have a to-do here. Where is there a to-do here? Cool. Build. Let's see what other errors we have. We have an error.
Another guard
Newsfeed, another godlet. So go to your save article button pressed. We're taking out the next line of code.
So does that mean that we don't need to do, no, we still need to do catch?
Yeah, that's different. Do catch is error being thrown from the data persistence. So everybody navigate to save article button pressed and remove line 70, yes? That's gone. Build. Newsfeed. Okay, let's go to newsfeed now. Right now we have two errors, correct?
Yes.
We have one in newsfeed and one in saved article. So let's navigate to the one that says newsfeed here, no arguments. And we need to clean that up. Because remember, we have a custom initializer now. We can't just create a random initializer with no arguments. Okay? So let's go ahead and clean that up. And clean that up, our article is also private. It doesn't show the error now, but very similar to what we had before. Once we initialize our article detail controller correctly, we'll have an error on 115. So let's go ahead and set up our article detail controller to take arguments. Again, very similar. Our article now needs a data persistence and an article. Very good. So here we pass in data persistence and we pass in an article. So you won't accidentally forget to pass things because you know what your view controller needs. There's no way to not pass what it needs. That's why the word dependency injection was coined there. If it needs it, it depends on it, you inject it with those dependencies. So now we have the two errors, as we said before, and we take out more code here. So this is gone, and that's our to-do, right? We did say to do after assessment. We will be using this. So great. So we came here after the assessment. So take out line 115, gone. Line 17, gone. This to do, we did that. Great. Build. And we have one more error in saved article view controller. Did everybody update their did select item at?
Yes.
Okay. Let's now go to saved article. And saved article, same thing. Let's update our article detail view controller to take in what it needs. It needs data persistence and an article. And this line is gone, this line is gone, and we are done with this to do. And we have no errors. Great. That leaves us with one view controller to fully encapsulate. And make sure that everything here is private at this point. So this guy becomes private. That'll give an error. Oh, we haven't done this one. That's the last one. Haha. Make sure you're in the saved article view controller, and we are working on our last view controller to encapsulate. So our data persistence becomes private. No longer do we need implicit unwrapping here. What else? That's all we need, right? Okay, cool. And as we remove the implicit, pay attention to the warning, because you get this in a code challenge, does it compile? You're in a class, does it compile? No, correct? Because what's the value of my data persistence right now? Nothing. It doesn't have a value. That's why the compiler error comes up here. At this point, our data persistence doesn't have a value. If I say this, it has a value of nil. Or if I do this, it has a value of nil. But if I do not give it any optional, it has no value, it hasn't been initialized yet. It's been declared, but not initialized. Okay? That's why we either have to give it a value, optional, or we have to create an initializer. Cool? All right, so we have our properties up here. Properties. And this is still property. And above our viewed load, we'll say initializers. And here, what does it need? Just data persistence, right? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So init data persistence, type data persistence, generic type article, self dot data persistence equals to data persistence, and here we call the super initializer, pass it nil here, great. And lastly, required init is required here, and build, and then this one error is gone. The error that said no initializers is gone now because we have an initializer that initializes our data persistence. This is our initializer here. And the next question was, what about our delegate? So at this point, we all will say here, right after our super, we'll say self dot data persistence dot delegate equal to self. Because that's the only controller that wants to listen for changes, correct? The one that the saved article controller is the one listening for changes when I save an article or I delete an article. Yes? And verify, make sure everything is private. Private, private, private.
Wait.
What's happened? Oh, what happened?
I'm getting. Oh, no, so we still don't have a number.
We have one error in the tab controller. We good? Can we navigate to the tab controller?
Can you go
Down to detail controller.
Like where we inject the
Detail saved
But
articles.
no, where we were, but just down where we did inject.
Oh, okay. Saved article. This guy? Deselect?
It doesn't seem the article.
Did select you talking about? Which method?
Oh wait, I think my article is on.
Spelled differently?
It's below.
Oh, okay. Yes, Eric.
We can take the data persistence models.
Yes, we're gonna go to the tab controller and clean that up.
Oh, we can take it out?
Yes, we're gonna go clean it up together. So that's the last thing we gotta do.
But I mean, it doesn't need to be in the view.
We put it in the init here. Eric, everybody please pay attention here. In my saved article, we have it in the initializer, right? It needs to be there. In the viewed load will be too late. Please pay attention here. If I put my data persistence.delegate in the viewed load, I actually have to navigate to that tab in order for my delegate to get registered. But if I do it in the initializer, the minute my tab controller creates me, my delegate is set. Cool? Great. All right. So you never have to navigate to that so it to automatically update. Lastly, let's go to the tab controller now and wrap up here. So tab controller, in our save article view, property initializer, let's give it what it needs. Again, data persistence, that's all it needs. Data persistence, again, it doesn't autocomplete here. Build, and now we have private properties, cannot be accessed here. So we need to remove view controller data persistence here, remove delegate here, and that's that, right? So at this point, our tab controller got slimmer, and everything is private, fully encapsulated, full object-oriented programming, right? Cool? Very good. So we know when we're submitting code to an employer, we submitting object-oriented principles, logic code to them. We don't have public everywhere. Cool? Very good. And tomorrow we'll take a look at how to inject a storyboard. Because prior to iOS 13, programmable UI, you could have inject using dependencies there with initializer, but you couldn't do it in storyboard. It took us 13 years, or whatever, not 13 years, but 13 iterations of iOS to actually allow our storyboards to get injected with a custom initializer. So we'll take a look at that tomorrow, and then we'll wrap up full dependency injection there. Cool? And then the notes are on the repo if in case you want to take a look at it, what it looks like with dependency injection on a storyboard. Any questions before we continue? So feel free to refactor your code, even your assessment there, whatever you're working on, the group project especially, to fully use dependency injection and fully encapsulate your dependencies. And take a look at the user preference here. We took a tangent and we created a delegate, because we love custom delegation, on our picker view, user preference, user defaults, right? So that's what the project uses. So you could take that same model into your New York Times Books app. Does that make sense? Right? Because we have a custom delegate object on the user preferences, we inject the user preferences. Whoever wants to listen for changes, who wants to listen for changes on the user preferences? In our case, it's the newsfeed, exactly. So when I change my picker view, newsfeed gets an update, right, via that custom delegation. Other than that, you have to do view will appear, which is a bit messy. We agreed, right? Yeah. How messy was that? So, right, view will appear. We really don't want to do stuff there. Keep it in viewed load. You want to do some custom listening, whatever. Notification center, delegation, KVO, any of those things is preferred as opposed to view will appear. Okay? Very good. Any other questions? All right, so we'll stop here.